Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the Dalí Museum. It is a wonderful, crisp, but beautiful morning, so I appreciate all of you surviving the weather to make it here to the Dalí Museum today. We are 1 week out from our exhibition, Magritte and Dali. We're really excited about that. We had contemplated a talk today about Magritte, but thought it might be a little bit too soon, so we're going to do something that's a little more broad. That certainly will be about Magritte, but we'll kind of set the stage for next week when we get to come to the museum. So what we decided to do today, what I decided to do, was to share with you information about Surrealism, a much more broad story about Surrealism and how it worked. And the impetus for this is actually a project that we worked on all of last year. We realized that we have a wonderful exhibition, and it's an exhibition that's been going since 1984, the Student Surrealist Art Exhibition. Originally it was started here in Pinellas County. Originally it actually happened apparently at Tyrone Mall. That's where the first show was. Eventually we were able to bring it into our museum in our old space. And as it grew, we eventually had Hillsborough. And then finally when we moved into this building, we decided to make a statewide show as well. One of the challenges, though, is that we call it the Student Surrealist Art Exhibition, but how was it in any way, shape, or form connected to Surrealism? Every student who participated created amazing images, but the history of the movement was completely not shared. It was not part of what we were able to do. It was probably not part of what the art teacher was able to do. So the disconnect started to really weigh on us that, there's such a rich tradition of Surrealism, but how do you explain it? It's massive. There are over 100 characters involved. There are years of history involved. How do you get from the student work to sharing with them some of the key ideas about this? Well, we had decided that it would be great to do some sort of PDF or some sort of video project. And finally, we decided that that would be the key way to tell the story. So we were very fortunate. We have a film and production company here in the area, Roundhouse. They were one of several groups that bid on the project. And what they introduced was the idea of using graphic motion to tell the story. And that's what we're going to conclude with today. We're going to present the video that we made with them. And it's really something we're extremely proud of. It took us a bit of time to do it. The voice you will hear is the woman on the upper left. That's Tara Siegel. The gentleman who is the director of the company is Andrew Lee. And the two of them, along with Joseph Nunez, who is their graphic designer and animator, they're the ones who really worked with us for months after months to try to figure out how you can take what I'm going to share with you over the next hour and put it into 8 minutes. That might be memorable, maybe. That's stating a lot. So the litany of things, we were asked, what do we want to accomplish with this 8-minute movie? What is it that we're going to try to achieve? I'm going to show you the 10 goals that we originally thought would be important. And you can see how many of them we were able to actually keep in the final project when you watch the video. The more broad concept was students should walk away from the video feeling that they were surprised by the depth of Dalí and Surrealism. So we knew Dalí was a big part of it. They should be challenged about their preconceptions of art and history. And they should be empowered to create their own student work. Those were the really broad categories. But the 10 big ideas that we had about what is Surrealism and what is it that we want them to be able to understand, it's ambitious, I'll put it that way. It begins with the idea that Surrealism is about dreams. It's about dreams in the unconscious. It's looking to Sigmund Freud and the idea that dreams are meaningful. There's something that you can pull from them that can be built upon. They are to be taken seriously, and there's a lot that you can understand about yourself and the world by paying attention to your dreams. The second one was that Sigmund Freud and the idea of psychoanalysis felt that there was a very common core that all people share through their unconscious and through the way the mind is wired that can be understood through mythology and symbolism. And so, going back to Greek mythology and other historical mythologies, there are ideas that the Surrealists were able to pull to make relevant and also that, that become a part of the story. The third goal, Surrealism was about shocking people, shocking you out of your complacency, shocking you out of your comfort zone, showing you something that can surprise, it can delight, but it certainly is not passive. We're not going to be looking at beautiful landscapes or traditional still lives. There's going to be something else added that will be an element of shock, the uncanny, the enigmatic, or the marvelous. The fourth idea, Surrealism was historical and existed because of a war, and it ended because of a war. So in addition to trying to tell them about these historical figures, these painters and writers, we also had to tell them a little bit about the war, World War I. What happened in Europe? Why did Surrealism even begin? Where did that come from? And when World War II arrived, what did that do to the movement? How did that break it up? There's a lot of different positions on this. Some people say it went longer than World War II, but for our story, we felt that World War II was when it ended, so we were really looking at 2 decades. We also wanted to emphasize the idea that Surrealism was not just about art, not just about painting, not just about developing a style, but it also had a philosophical position, that it felt that philosophy could be understood and embraced, and that the art was simply at the service for the much broader philosophy about making man basically more whole, looking at areas that seemingly art didn't explore and trying to bring those to the fore. That's number 5. We got 10 of them. So we're halfway there. Number 6 was that unlike most movements, say Cubism, where there were a group of friends, but often you think Picasso, you think Braque, you think Greece. These are individuals who are changing the world. Surrealism was about suppressing the individual and trying to make a collective statement. And that's a hard concept to share, but it's something that we felt was very important about it. It was a group effort. The 7th one was that the Surrealists paid attention to the irrational, but they didn't look at the irrational exclusively and ignore our rational mind. Their goal was to try to bring these two into balance. And so that was an ambitious goal, came out of their philosophy. The 8th idea was that in order to pursue these new ideas and in order to get access to the dreams and to the unconscious, Surrealism explored new techniques in both writing and in artwork. And so there was a whole litany of new things that they were exploring, everything from grattage to rubbings to impressions to collage. All of these were often in order to trick your training, so to speak, and give you quicker access to something that's much more pure, much more intuitive, and not about planning in advance. These are the ideas behind it. Another really big idea is that Surrealism is not only about history and the wars, but it also had a very strong political agenda. And in a way, mirroring themselves after the Futurists, the Surrealists were actually engaged politically in the historical context, protesting different actions in the government, trying to constantly be a voice against the bourgeoisie, against the establishment, to constantly be present in the dialogue about political things that matter. And then the 10th big idea for us is Dalí's a bit of a problem in all of this. He's essential to us, he is essential to Surrealism, but whenever you talk to somebody about Surrealism, he's sort of the black sheep. He's difficult. And the reason that Dalí is really difficult is that he was only with the group for 10 years. He was younger than a lot of the others. And there were 3 things that he did not value that they did. 1, he did not value political action. He was not really a team player when it came to communism. He also loved getting paid. He loved being a commercial artist. André Breton and the group of Surrealists were supposedly to be doing this altruistically, that they were to be finding their ways to make money somehow or another out of the air, but they were not to be profiting for their style in the art market, and yet many of them were dealers, so there's a bit of a lie there. And then the third thing was that Surrealism was about trying to find a balance between the irrational and the rational. Dalí was about amplifying the irrational. He wasn't concerned about the rational world. He wasn't concerned about political action. He wasn't concerned about what you can do in the here and now to make life better for people. He just wanted to live in the irrational all the time. So these are 3 difficulties that we knew we had to somehow or another address in the film. So those are the 10 ideas. And now I'm going to go through a very, very quick but sweeping view of Surrealism from beginning to end. And then you get to see it all over again in 8 minutes at the very end of this. So we have a high goal for ourselves today, and we're about 15 minutes in. Okay, so history, key figures, works, ideas, yada, yada, lots of stuff. Surrealism was one of many isms of the 20th century. everything from cubism, futurism, expressionism, synthesism. And this is Alfred Barr's chart of all the different isms in the art world and how they all feed into one another, and it's absolutely amazing. You can see Surrealism is over here coming out of Dada on the bottom left-hand side, but ultimately in the mid-1940s, 1950s, it was all about abstraction. And so every art movement of the 20th century up until 1945 winds up leading to either geometric abstraction or non-geometric abstraction. You know, so abstract expressionists and other abstract artists, you know, Piet Mondrian, people like that. So this was the world that they basically created, and this is how things were seen mid-century in the 1900s. Here's a definition online from Wikipedia, or from artmovement.com. It says, Surrealism is an art movement dedicated to expressing the imagination as revealed in dreams, free of conscious control of reason and convention. It is an anti-rationalist movement shaped by emerging theories from on our perception of reality, the most obvious being Freud's influence of the unconscious. So that just restates a lot of the 10 ideas that we were trying to work through. And of course, historically, it begins with crisis. So the crisis is World War I. Just an entire generation decimated through the horrors of the First World War. Was the first mechanized battle. Many people associated with Surrealism were injured during the war. Many of them dropped out. And the first artistic expression in reaction to the war, which was all in Europe, was Dada. And Dada is something we're not really going to be talking about, but it's mentioned very briefly in the video as well. So between about 1916 and 22, a number of people either gathered in Switzerland as a way of disengaging from what was happening around them on the front, or they wound up forming right after the war in different places, different cities. And there's actually a number of cities, 6 in particular, Hanover, Berlin, Cologne, New York, Paris, and in Switzerland, where congregations of people wound up almost at the same time getting together who had artistic backgrounds but started to create absurdist works, works that were about protest. They were not about celebrating beauty. And there was so much energy and negativity at the same time that these movements eventually burned themselves out. Lots and lots of very key, important figures, but very dark responses to what was happening to them through the world. And there was an incredible amount of energy, but because of the negativity, it eventually could not build on itself. And so what happened was a number of people, particularly in Paris, which was the last city where Dada formed, there was a group of people who started to think maybe there were some other possibilities. Maybe there's some ways to push through to get past the negativity and actually build on this incredible energy and the incredible kind of charisma of the figures who are starting to gather here. And this is a painting in 1922 by Max Ernst, one of the key surrealists, who brings together a number of people that were, interacting often. There's also a couple key heroes. There's Galileo, I believe. There's Dostoevsky, but there's also the key writers that became known as the Surrealists. So dreams and myth become a big part of what is also becoming interesting at the end of World War I. There's suddenly a group of people who are socially interested in what psychoanalysis was starting to explore and starting to discover. And of course, what happens is Sigmund Freud, much earlier than this, starts to give scientific recognition to the meaning behind dreams and the unconscious. And this is really a very quiet, small, radical step in the world of psychology and psychoanalysis to exploring the mind in a very different way than it had been explored scientifically. And in 1899 to 1900, he publishes The Interpretation of Dreams. So this is 1900. The war happens between 1914 and 1918. It's not until about 1920 to even a little bit after that people outside of that small world of scientists start to become interested and intuitively sense that what he was talking about had great relevance for them. So that's another part of the story that they had to, that we had to deal with, is how does this idea of the unconscious suddenly fit into the story that we're trying to tell about all these people and paintings? And Freud proposed that dreams are symbolic and they need to be deciphered. that they tell us something that's very essential about ourselves, and that we are very much at danger if we ignore them or try to constantly dismiss them and explain them away. Dreams have real power and real meaning, and if you don't come to terms with your irrational side, eventually things like World War I wind up being the result. You know, you've repressed so much that society works itself out in some very violent and horrifying ways. And as I said, he constantly looked to the unconscious through mythology. That was a very important part of how he formed his ideas, in particular the story of Oedipus and the relation between fathers and sons, which becomes really important to our story about Salvador Dali and his difficulties with his father. So all of this leads to one particular man coming up with an idea and becoming sort of the spokesperson for all of this, and that's this gentleman, André Breton. He was the man who essentially founded Surrealism. And it's not that Surrealism wasn't already sort of happening, but he was not only an instigator, but he was a doctrinarian, what would be the right word, a charismatic figure who wanted to always control and find ways of building philosophically on the ideas and energy of other people. And he became known dismissively as the Pope of Surrealism, but for our purposes, that's really a good way to think of him. Surrealism could not have existed in the way it does without his kind of force, his conviction, and the difficulties he presented for everybody around him. He wrote two particular manifestos which spelled out what the movement was about, and he was constantly rethinking his position and the position of those around him. And going back to the First World War, a lot of his ideas came from the fact that he had been trained as a medical student, and he had a background in psychiatry, and he found himself working on a number of soldiers who suffered from shell shock. So he was on the front line in France. He was seeing people who suffered from shell shock, and as he listened to them talk about how they were perceiving things after really horrible trauma, he started to realize that there's this almost poetic world that's starting to be revealed, that the mind is capable of convincing us of much more than what we take to be the case, the consensual case of what the world is and what it should be. That these were soldiers who were starting to see things very differently. There was one person in particular who was convinced that the war was all theater, that the bombs and the blood, that was all just a stage that he was on, and he was just seeing things that others had presented, but it wasn't real. And this led Breton to think that there's something about the way the human mind works that psychoanalysis can present to us and share. So he starts to experiment. He's a writer, he's a poet, and he eventually publishes this book in 1924 called The Manifesto of Surrealism. It's the first place where Surrealism becomes an official movement. So this is October of 1924, and he defines Surrealism in two different ways. The first place he says, and many of you have heard me read through these words many times, but it is easy to get lost in them. He defined it as psychic automatism in the pure state by which one proposes to express either verbally or by the written word or any other method, including painting, the actual functioning of thought. So he felt that there was some way that we were able to communicate more directly that had been ignored up until this point. It should be thought dictated in the absence of any control exercised by reason and exempt from aesthetic or moral concern or censorship. So he felt that our rational mind constantly is censoring our thoughts, our things that we're able to share with others. They were trying to find a way around this. And then he goes on to share a philosophical definition of the movement. So he actually writes the encyclopedia definition of Surrealism at this point. Surrealism is based on the belief in the superior reality of certain forms of previously neglected associations, in the omnipotence of dreams, and the disinterested play of thought. It's a very ambitious idea. It's a very, I won't say narcissistic, but it's giving yourself a lot of credit that you are about to open up a new universe. And in a way, that's exactly what they did. And it's because there were so many people who started to share an interest in these ideas. And trying to keep us on track. Here's the really interesting thing. So we think about Surrealism as being only about the irrational, only about dreams, but he states right from the very beginning, André Breton says, I believe in the future resolution of these two states, dream and reality, which seem so contradictory, and they should become an absolute reality, a surreality. So his goal from the beginning was not to live in the irrational, but it was that the irrational is where there's something extremely important. They were the sort of pioneers going and exploring that, but they were to bring back the treasures that we all would benefit from. That's probably the best way to think about it. And the word surrealist came from one of their heroes, from Apollinaire, a French writer, who had used it in a play called The Breast of Tiresias in 1917. So there was a lot of things happening between 1917 and 1924 that all became part of what was systematized in the Manifesto. So poetry must be made by all and not by one. That was one of the statements of their hero, Lautréamont, and that leads to the idea of collectivity. So the Surrealism as a movement was started by a writer and a bunch of writers, and almost nary an artist in sight. So this is a photograph of many of the writers who made that transition from Dada to Surrealism. There's a group of people, it's not one person or two people, but they're all writers and they're all joined together in this effort to explore the unconscious. And this is a later photograph, but it's that idea that the unconscious mind contains a wellspring to be tapped into. They are trying to gather together to find that. I love that melody. Yes, perfect background for this. Praise yourself. Let's see. So they used magazines. This is what's really interesting about Surrealism, is that it positioned itself in a very point in time when ideas were shared through magazines. Now we have TV, we have the internet, but at this time it was like if you have a group of people all coming up with interesting ideas, the way you disperse those ideas is through publications. And so they started from 1924, almost immediately, they had a magazine that they would have come out 2 to 3 times a year. It was disseminated through different European cities, and lots of people started to find out about the ideas of Surrealism, which leads to the idea about what were the things that they wanted to share in their magazine. Well, this all comes back to the first wave of Surrealism, 1924 to 30. Before Dalí arrives, there was something that they referred to as automatism. And it was the idea that they were experimenters and they were trying to find the most quick and pure way to get access to a kind of a voice in your unconscious without worrying about all the artistic training that you brought with you, all that baggage that came from school, from all the classes that you studied, from all the people that you listened to. They felt that there was something much more direct that was constantly being censored by all your learning. So they were trying to find ways to create immediacy to the experience of sharing artistic ideas. One thing that they did, and here you see they're all surrounding a typewriter, is they started to experiment with automatic writing. Similar to Gertrude Stein and others from the early part of the 20th century, but they would actually try different techniques, like sitting in front of a typewriter with a metronome and creating different timings for having words basically spill out and be recorded quickly. So the idea was that they would try to find a voice, they would try to record that voice through their words by typing without worrying if it made any sense. And what they found is that when they look back at these practices, which seem like complete gibberish, it's like the idea of the 100 monkeys with a typewriter, what happened is certain passages started to make a lot of sense, started to be very coherent, started to convince André Breton and his colleagues that there is some sort of controlling voice that's much more poetic and magical that we just choose to ignore most of the time. And over time, within about a year, there was another artist who became very important to this, André Masson. And he was the first person to really master a visual equivalent of automatic writing. So automatism, automatic. What he started to do was sit in front of a sheet of paper and very quickly start to allow lines to form, start to just draw without any particular destination, any goal. But at a certain point, he would stop, he would look at the patterns that were created, and he would start to recognize forms, and then he would start to define those further. And what shocked him was how often the forms seemed to have very personal relevance to him. So it's a little bit like a Rorschach test. It's like creating something random, and then through the randomness and chaos, starting to recognize things that you define further. And for people like Breton, this became a revelation. It was the idea that visual arts, just like the written arts, also have a role within this the story that they're trying to develop. And then we have the exquisite corpse. This is the line that is always shared. It's the exquisite corpse will drink the new wine. This was basically like an aphorism that was created collectively. So 4 people playing this game, folded a sheet of paper. First person wrote the noun, the next person wrote the verb, next person wrote the predicate, and then when they read it together, it seemed as if collectively they had created something that was really evocative and poetic and strange. And they started to do parlor games like this. They created exquisite corpses. They would fold a sheet of paper. You know, many of you have done it here. We've been celebrating this for many years, but somebody would draw the head or the top part, fold it over. The next person, without seeing that, would draw the upper torso, then the lower torso, and then finally the bottom of the torso, the legs. And there were fantastic creations. Certainly they didn't create this. It was a parlor game that children had played for years, but they were the first people to start thinking about it as an actual strategy. And here you can see another version of it. So it was a collective. This one was done by Breton, his girlfriend at that time, Victor Valentine Hugo, Paul Eluard, and his wife, Tush. And basically, Breton summarizes this process. He says, finally, with the exquisite corpse, we had at our command an infallible way of holding the critical intellect in abeyance and of fully liberating the mind's metaphorical activity. So he felt that these quick creations that were done spontaneously, probably with a great deal of alcohol, would eventually lead to metaphors that could provide us with, an ability to go even further. So who were some of the people that they were interested in? Certainly Arnold Böcklin, and this idea of this kind of late 19th century haunting Gothic romantic imagery, which seems to be very pertinent to Freudian analysis as well. And this piece has a great relevance. Just as an aside, The Isle of the Dead by him was a painting that was both revered by Sigmund Freud, who used it who talked about a particular dream he had related to it, but also it was one of the favorite paintings of Adolf Hitler. And so how those two figures come together through this visual art, I'm not quite sure, but it seems very powerful. Giorgio de Chirico. We always think of him as a surrealist, but his great works were done before surrealism even existed. Actually before World War I, right at that same period of time. So this is a piece called Love Song. This is the piece that actually led René Magritte to become a painter of the surrealist style. Very powerful images that seem to be juxtapositions of things that do not belong together, but when they're brought together with these strange shadows and strange, very shallow spaces, they seem very haunting and evocative of dreams. And then from a very different perspective, people like Marcel Duchamp, who were just fascinated by the idea of creating something to create controversy, something that just completely shuts down what art was all about up until this point. So placing a bicycle wheel on a stool, suddenly, is that art? What does that mean if it's art? How do we proceed after that? And even more importantly, the urinal, the smack in the face of every bourgeois artistic intellectual, to say this is art and it is a very unpleasant art that we have to deal with. So these were very influential to the surrealists. And then during this first decade, and this is where we can go pretty quick because now we've talked about the key ideas. André Masson, I mentioned him. He was the one who discovered the first way to really do automatic drawing. And he started as a cubist, but he started to be interested in dreams and cubism, which was a very unusual combination. And eventually it led to his sand paintings, which were very violent, very evocative images that seem to come from the unconscious. They don't seem to be very finely designed as this painting is, but they seem much more impulsive and process-oriented. And that fascinated everybody involved with the movement. There was Yves Tanguy. He was a gentleman born in Brittany and had no formal training, but he saw a de Chirico painting, just like Magritte did. Suddenly he had to become a painter. And this was in the first period of his work in 1927. His paintings seem to create a world that we don't recognize. We don't know where they are. There's nothing in particular we can point to and say, this is a ship, this is a horse, this is a guitar. But certainly we'll look at this and it seems like there's something happening and we want to know more. And we start to project our own readings of it. And that becomes a kind of dream space that we can all start to look at and interact with without knowing if you're right or wrong. This had a lot of influence on Salvador Dali. When Dali saw these works, it really created the opportunity for him to start thinking about how he could become a surrealist. And this from a little bit later, in 1927, Mama, Papa is Wounded. The title seems very much a kind of Freudian title about kind of Arthurian legend and sexual wounds and how all this comes into being. And yet we have these strange characters that we don't know what they are, but it does look like there's a kind of hairy phallic shape on the right-hand side. Seems to be some sort of green shape of a figure in the background. And we start to read them as if we know what they are that we're looking at. That becomes really powerful. And there's a horizon of some sort. It may be under the water, it may be on the moon. We have no idea where we are, but we know it doesn't look familiar, but we think we kind of can understand what's going on in it. Another really important artist, of course, is Miro. And for us, Miro was the person who helped Dali become introduced to the Surrealists. And he was of an earlier generation, 11 years older than Dali. And he was Catalan. And his most famous painting, the one that really created an idea for how Surrealism could be seen visually, was done before Surrealism existed. The Farm was done in 1920 to 21. It was owned by Ernest Hemingway. And it became this very curious sort of medieval notion of modernism, where this was the most important place in his universe, was the farm that the family owned, and he loved every aspect of it. He had been trained as an artist. He had also spent time as a cubist, but by this point, he's trying to create a style that allows him to almost enumerate everything that was important about the farm. So there's one chicken, there's one particular kind of plant, a corn plant, there's one tree in the center. All of these are made sure that they're placed within the space. It's an absolutely fascinating painting, and again, had a lot of influence on people who became surrealists. Later, he would go on to develop more childlike approaches to painting. So again, very abstract, but definitely there's a rabbit at the bottom. We know there's a hunter because this is called the hunter. The hunter is the figure who's right here. You can see his pipe, he's urinating, he's carrying a gun, and he's about to get the quarry, which is this rabbit that's running very quickly. Very evocative, but this was very shocking when it was first seen in galleries, in 1923. Nobody was doing things like this, but it became the language of Surrealism. And so this is a phrase that's constantly referred back to by Lautréamont as beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissecting table. This was actually written in the late 1800s, but this particular passage became universally embraced by all of the Surrealists as the perfect metaphor. It's a very Freudian metaphor written before Freud had any influence whatsoever. There was no Freud to read to become, to actually lead to a passage like this. But many of the Surrealists illustrated his book, La Chance de Malraux, The Songs of Malraux. And when we open the Magritte show, you'll see that both Magritte and Dali did illustrations for this particular book, as did many of the Surrealists. Really important artist in this first decade as well was Max Ernst. And I should probably mention that André Masson was on the French side. He was wounded. Breton served in the field during World War I. He was a medic. He saw a lot of trauma. Max Ernst served on the German side, and he was probably responsible for bombing some of the French on the other side. But he completely and totally disconnected from the world around him. He was from Cologne, and he and another friend, Bargel, started to create their own Cologne Dada movement. And eventually, about 1922, he has a chance to meet Paul Éluard, and he basically gets into France, and he becomes a really important part of this sort of French-dominated movement called Surrealism. And he is absolutely extraordinary. He is probably the most informed about Freudian writing because he was reading Freud in university. He was well-trained in philosophy as well as math. And he was familiar, because Freud was writing in German, he was reading it before any of the French started to read Freud. So he really knew Freud well. This is done again before Surrealism, but it's very much about Surrealism. This is the language of Surrealism. And it's got one of my favorite titles. It's the Graminius bicycle, garnished with bells, the dappled fire damps, and the echinoderms bending the spine to look for caresses. It's a combination of microbes and just strange objects that suddenly look like they're performing at a circus. You know, there's something about it we feel like we completely know what's going on, and yet when you look at it, it's like, what are these things? And we don't know. But he used collage. That was one of the methods that he explored. This is a piece clearly influenced by the Curator, but actually created so that it's in a frame, but the frame is also part of it. You can see there's a little hinged gate that opens onto the frame. And then there's these strange things that are happening. And it's called Two Children Menaced by a Nightingale. This is a young girl who seems to be running with a knife in her hand. There seems to be some sort of body, but we're not quite sure, wrapped up down here. We assume that's the nightingale over on the left. And then there seems to be another character fleeing off to the other side. So it's like we're just in a crime novel where we just get all the characters and all the things that are happening, but we don't know what happened. And it's very provocative, and it's very much something that we want to explore further. So it gets into that dream space. He also discovered the interest in rubbings. He started to have a visionary capacity that realized through rubbings, it started to suggest things that seemed to come from his unconscious that he would then pursue and define, like this character here. He also was fascinated by collage, and he would go back and he would use not only catalogs from different companies, but he would also use penny novels and these curious stories from the 19th century that he would then recombine into these very evocative ways that would tell a very ulterior type of story. This is, and again, this influenced everyone in Surrealism. He was fascinated by decalcomania, pressing wet paint between glass panels, and when you pull it away after it's dried a little bit, it creates a random pattern, and he would start to define and work with those random patterns through rubbings, through adding paint, and create these evocative worlds that, again, seem like they're from our unconscious. And lastly, he was able to eventually develop this into a style that became very, very powerful about the world and about monsters and creatures. And so this is the Temptation of St. Anthony, actually done right after World War II, where he's still using decalcomania, but creating these incredibly evocative worlds that seem like they're out of Hieronymus Bosch. So that was the first decade. Second decade, 1930s, is when things become a little more familiar to a lot of us. And the second manifesto was written in 1929, at the very end of that decade. Breton was pissed. People were not behaving the way he wanted them to, and he excommunicated a bunch of people that were in the first wave of Surrealism. He also welcomed a bunch of new people, and he basically stated that, it's a new game now. And it's still very much a collective group. There's lots of people involved at this point, even though there's a lot of excommunications. In this chessboard, you can see that Dalí and Magritte are both on the scene at this point. And the really important thing politically was Breton felt that they needed to move into the next state, which had to do with political involvement. And he really wanted Surrealism to find a way to merge into and find a role within the French Communist Party. He felt that communism was the way to realize the hopes and dreams that they were working on in a much more political way. Of course, it's not surprising that didn't work. The French Communist Party had no room for the Surrealists. They found them to be a bunch of petty bourgeois idealists and basically said no, which led to a lot of very serious things, including even a suicide within the group. So what's happening at this point? Magritte arrives, which is great. He actually arrived 1927, so about 2 years before the second manifesto. He comes to Paris from Brussels. He starts to do work that's very much influenced by the Curator. Breton knows him, he meets with him, he's part of the group, but Breton invites him to dinner in 1929 and apparently insults his wife by making a comment about a cross that she had. Breton was insulted by the rosary that she had, and as a result, Magritte was insulted, and by 1930 he moves back to Brussels, and he's not part of the 30s in Paris, but this is when he suddenly becomes really important to André Breton. So Breton talks about Magritte a lot and uses work by Magritte to talk about Surrealism, even though at this point he's not in Paris and is gone. He's really not part of this. So as Magritte says, life obliges him to do something, so he paints. A couple key works, of course, This Is Not a Pipe, a work that we're all familiar with, The Treachery of Images and The Treachery of Words.
Neither the word pipe nor the image of a pipe is a real pipe, and that's part of the semantics of understanding that he starts to take something very simple and turn it into a lesson that becomes very strange. And he uses a very deliberately flat style. Here's a second painting by him that's very provocative. It's called The Human Condition. And everything about it seems very normal until you realize that the painting on the easel is slightly shifted. It's in front of us, but it looks exactly like what should be behind the easel. So are we seeing a window and there is nothing on the easel, or what's being hidden to us, from us, by that work on the easel? So it's this sort of Twilight Zone enigma. We're not sure what's going on, but it doesn't seem right. And then how do mirrors work? Well, they don't behave normally in Surrealism. So this is a double portrait. And then, of course, Dalí arrives as well. So we've got Magritte, and then shortly after that, Dalí arrives in 1929, right when Breton is writing the second Manifesto. A lot of people have been kicked out. Dalí suddenly comes in and has lots of opportunities. And he says that it has to be said once and for all, art critics, artists, etc., that they need to expect nothing from the new Surrealist images but disappointment, distaste, and repulsion. That, for Dalí, was what Surrealism was all about. So that idea of shocking and provoking, that comment is all about that. Of course, he makes the movie, The Andalusian Dog, which is so shocking and yet fun. And that is a very surprising combination. He makes the image that becomes the icon of Surrealism, the persistence of memory, talking about dreams in the unconscious. And he goes on to incredible moments of glory, such as Three Young Surrealist Women, where suddenly fashion is presented in a very dreamlike way, in a very disturbing way. And he also masters what he calls the paranoid critical method, or the paranoid critical image, finding ways to show us an image that can be two things at once. So both the bust of Voltaire on this table, or a group of figures in the background standing in front of an opening. And that leads to a sense of doubt that maybe the world around us also is not what we take it to be, but if we spent more time looking, it might behave the way a Dalí painting behaves, which is a very disturbing thought. Of course, the second generation, this is also when women start to show with Surrealism, but more importantly, they really start to show after they finally leave Surrealism. But it gives a lot of opportunity for women to think about their role within the visual arts and dreams and the unconscious. And they also find that a bunch of the men are pretty horrible. And so really their careers start independently of the Surrealist movement proper.
Who are they?
We have Toyin, or actually we have Murray Oppenheim on the upper left. We have Leonard Carrington in the middle. We have Frida Kahlo on the right. At the bottom, it's Remedios Varos and Toyin from Czechoslovakia. And just to give you a few ideas about their imagery, along with Dalí's, this is Murray Oppenheim's Fur-lined Teacup, probably the other great icon of Surrealism that was done at that period of time, done in reaction to a comment by Picasso. She was working for, I believe, either Schiaparelli or Coco Chanel, probably Schiaparelli. She had done a bracelet lined with fur. Picasso looked at it and said, you could probably line anything with fur. She was having tea with him. She went back to her studio and later that year purchased the tea set and created this amazingly provocative object. Leonore Carrington was with Max Ernst for a number of years. She did this powerful painting, which was not really discovered by the outside world until 1975. This seems like one of those other major icons of Surrealism, and it was done at the time she was associated with them, but it wasn't shown in their exhibitions. So it wasn't until much later, decades later, before this self-portrait of her and this idea of the kind of the dream world where she's visited by the hyena, and there's the rocking horse in the background without a tail, which is then mirrored with this sort of horse running free in the environment past the window, which she doesn't seem to be able to get to. In many ways, this is an icon of Surrealism that just was not seen by most of the Surrealists. And then, of course, Frida Kahlo, who Breton pronounced a Surrealist, but she said, absolutely not, I have nothing to do with those scoundrels. But, this is the amazing double portrait, the two Fridas, which becomes so provocative and so dreamlike, and so much a part of Latin American magic realism, which is parallel with Surrealism. So winding things up, amazing events happen, amazing exhibits happen. We know Dalí gave a lecture in a diving suit in 1936. He was trying to talk about how Surrealists are like deep sea divers going into the unconscious waters to bring up the treasure from the bottom. We also know that he almost died. He almost suffocated because someone had closed the door on the hose, leading to him flailing about, which led him to be basically applauded until people realized he was really in trouble. But because of this particular moment, in the London Times the next day, he was the leading, on the culture page, great performance by Salvador Dali at new Surrealist exhibition. So there were moments that Dali added that actually brought great attention in the ways we want them to Surrealism. And of course, there was also the really memorable 1938 International Exhibition, which contained Dali's Rainy Taxi. We have our rainy rolls out here. Also, during the Duchamp show, we talked about the entrance, which was, the main area had all these coal sacks over a brazier. In order to see the artwork, you had to use a flashlight to get close to it. And of course, we know that all of these incredible things start to become very violent towards the end of the 1930s, which of course is because the war is starting to mount up. So from 1932 on, there's a great consciousness about what Hitler represents and how much it terrifies everybody. So there's a group of people, many of them from the Dada movement, many of the Surrealists, were starting to have very, very specific political awareness of what's happening in Germany. And by 1937, there's the Degenerate Art Exhibition, where you very quickly come to understand how the Germans feel about all modern art, which is that from Picasso to Magritte to Ernst, these are all seen as the problem, the un-German, Jewish, Bolshevik evils that needed to be purged, and they were all put on display to be laughed at and then all destroyed afterwards. So it was a very public way to announce their intentions. And of course, within that same year, Guernica is bombed, and it leads to the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, which then leads to World War II. So Spanish Civil War is the moment when everything starts to change. The Surrealists are all engaged with this. Even Benjamin Paré, one of the poets, winds up serving, fighting against Franco's legions. And this is when the works get even darker. So the early part of the 1930s, there's a lot of personal biographical psychoanalytic material that's shared in the paintings and in the writings. By the end of the decade, things become much more universally horrifying, much more like dreams that we all are sharing, coming right out of Goya. So one of Dali's very most important paintings, The Premonition of Civil War from 1936, has this Goya-esque beast. The 1940 to 42 painting by Max Ernst, which is one of the most amazing paintings ever, uses decalcomania to create a wasteland about this kind of mythic horror that follows the war. Yves Tanguy is painting really provocative works that seem, once again, very dreamlike, but also very uncomfortable, unsettling. They seem very sinister. Which is very specifically reactions to the war. And somewhere in the midst of all of this, Miró, who is living in Spain, basically not showing his head anywhere because of threat that he may, be rounded up by Franco's legions, finds escape in the imagination and produces some of his most beautiful cosmic visions in these very, very deep and dark period of time. So the constellations are created during World War II by Miró. So of course, what happens is we're at the end of that decade, the war breaks out, and suddenly it's about survival. So America becomes really important, but also it becomes the end of the group. Historically, many of the Surrealists were able to find their way to the US, fortunately through Varian Fry and the Emergency Rescue Committee. And many artists, not just Surrealists, wind up finding themselves in New York City, and a lot of credit needs to be given to people like Peggy Guggenheim, who saw the importance of basically protecting this generation of creative, imaginative people who rethought what the world should be. And so this photograph has many Surrealists, but it also has people who are definitely alien from Surrealism, like Mondrian. Peggy Guggenheim helped to create a new world in America, which provided a vision and an outlet for a lot of the Surrealists. And of course, here we have This is the Guggenheim Gallery, which also shows, you can see Max Ernst and others. And one of the most extraordinary presentations was created by Marcel Duchamp. This is 1942. It was called The First Papers of Surrealism, where many of the Surrealists were exhibited in New York, but then he created this incredibly labyrinthian web of string. So you would have to fight your way through the string in order to get close enough to see any of the work, which apparently really upset a lot of the artists because a lot of people didn't get very close to see their work. But it's an extraordinary idea, an idea that's completely part of Surrealism. But of course, you know, everything ends. And in 1945, the world changes completely. And this is that moment where abstract expressionism becomes the language of art moving forward, and Surrealism is sort of left behind, even though they were very influential on it. And some would argue that Surrealism continues until André Breton passes in 1966, but for the purposes of the story, and for many people, World War II, really, the end of World War II is the end of Surrealism, because as a collective, they no longer really exist. So I'm actually going to skip the lingering questions because I think those are pretty obvious, but what I want to do is just say that, so we had an hour's worth of stuff I just shared with you. How do we tell that to students and make them not go to sleep or become aggravated or throw things at their teacher? One thing that was really amazing, and there were two partners, Sarah Fornoff and Yvonne Maroulier were the two people I was working with Roundhouse. And it became really difficult. We kept coming up with script after script, and it was too long. And finally, Yvonne came up with a really perfect solution. And I just want to share this. It's like, how do you take all that and move it into 8 minutes? Well, you only allow for a script that has a character, has 142 characters, like texting. Do not write anything that's more than 142 characters. Any story you want to share, 142 characters. And that seemed absurd and ridiculous, but what you're going to see is the result of it because it really worked. So that is the background to this, but now what I want to do, of course, is share with you the video.
This is Salvador Dalí. He's a famous artist with a famous mustache. And this is André Breton. He's also famous, but you've probably never heard of him. He did not have a mustache. Breton and Dalí both became known for their role in a group called the Surrealists. And when you look at what that group did, you might think they were all crazy. But they were actually quite serious. And they ended up changing the course of history. Well, art history anyway. People use the word surreal
How surreal.
to describe things that are crazy
Whoa.
or too strange to be real.
Surreal.
But surrealism was about more than just melting clocks. It was about philosophy, politics, art, and revolution. Surrealism was a movement, a group of people who focused on the world of dreams in order to create a new reality. A reality that was beyond real, or surreal. To understand surrealism, you have to understand Paris in the early 1900s. It was stuffy, proper, full of rational, well-mannered people buying mild, decorative art and living life on their best behavior. And then, the world went to war. World War I changed everything. André Breton, who was a 19-year-old poet at the time, was sent to war as a medic, and that is a seriously traumatic way to grow up. For 4 straight years, Europe was violence, disease, and death. Soldiers watched whole cities crumble, suffered gas attacks, and rotted alive in the trenches. Nearly 60% of the men who went to war suffered casualties. By the end of the war, almost 38 million people were injured, imprisoned, missing, or dead. Afterwards, Europe was a disaster. Breton and everyone else who made it out alive were scarred for life, and the world as they knew it was basically ruined. The war made people question their own society and start to look for a different way to live. Breton and his friends figured that if the traditional, rational approach to life had ended in war, maybe it was time to try something new. They began rebelling against authority, the government, the church, the well-to-do members of society, and did everything they could to disrupt order. They joined an aggressive group called Dada that used art to make political statements, and they acted out against anyone telling them how to live their life. This was a totally different type of art. But Breton and his friends truly thought they could avoid another war by inspiring others to reject the reasonable, rational way of thinking that Europe was used to. They were looking for revolution. They didn't find it in Dada, but after months of experimental writing, Breton had a breakthrough. He had an inspiring dream about a man cut in half by a window. When he woke up, he realized we're not in control of everything that goes on in our mind. There's a hidden part, a disorderly imagination, and this is called the unconscious. Sigmund Freud, the father of the unconscious, first identified this hidden or unconscious part of our brain. He said the conscious mind contains the thoughts we're aware of, but it only makes up a small part of what's going on in our head. Inside the unconscious mind is the stuff we're not aware of, the deep, hidden part of ourselves that drives our fears, desires, and strange ideas. The unconscious mind creates our irrational thoughts, or the thoughts that confuse, scare, and disgust us. This was the revolutionary idea Breton had been looking for. He believed that when people ignore or suppress their irrational thoughts, they become imbalanced, and that leads to an imbalanced society, which then leads to horrible things like war. To create more balance, Breton wanted to access the unconscious mind and set the irrational thoughts free. He and a bunch of other radical writers got together to do just that. They called themselves Surrealists. As their leader, Breton wrote and published a book called the Manifesto of Surrealism, where he defined the word and officially established the group and their goals. The unconscious mind communicates through symbols in our dreams, so the Surrealists focused on the dream world. They rejected society's demand for everything to make sense, instead embracing the things that don't make sense. They said it's okay to be odd, it's okay to be scared, it's okay to shock or be shocked.
It's cool.
Surrealists did everything as a group and developed new techniques by just messing around together. They were really into automatism, a process where they basically just wrote or drew everything that came into their minds, no matter what it was. Literally whatever. After writers, painters joined the group, and Surrealist ideas started spreading throughout Europe, involving the public through Surrealist magazines, books, films, and art shows. Surrealists use a lot of the same artistic elements, and recognizing these is a good way to spot a Surrealist art piece. Look for the dreamlike effect that's often seen in Surrealist art and writing. Elements like dislocation, juxtaposition, and transformation. Surrealist artwork doesn't follow just one style or look. It's the thinking behind it that makes it surrealism. It doesn't need to be pretty. It doesn't have to make sense. And it can shock and disgust people and still be art, so long as it comes from the unconscious mind. So, back to Salvador Dalí. You know, the mustache. Well, Dalí was just a child in Spain during World War I, so he didn't share the traumatic experiences of the early Surrealists. But later, as an art student, Dalí followed the Surrealists from afar. He was a fan of Freud and was forever looking for the next big thing to be part of, and the Surrealists were it. But by the time Dalí came to Paris, Surrealism was in crisis. Breton's priorities were shifting, and he wanted the group to be more political. His vision was to use creativity and political action to change the world, but not everyone agreed with him, so he threw those people out. Then, Dalí and his friend Louis Buñuel made a film called Un chien andalou, this one. It was shocking, violent, and full of the dreamlike sequences Surrealists were going nuts for. The Parisian public was scandalized by it, but they couldn't wait to see more. One of the main goals of Surrealism was to shock and surprise, and Dalí had that covered. Breton and the Surrealists loved the film, and they latched on to Dalí. He was a never-ending idea machine full of life and humor, and he brought enthusiasm and fun back to the group. Surrealism soon spread to all types of media, not just paintings. There were drawings, sculptures, film, collage, and Dalí was one of the only surrealists who created something in nearly every single one. Dalí used surrealism to express his deepest thoughts and struggles. Instead of hiding his fears and burying his issues, he used art to fully express himself, turning the uncomfortable parts of his life into unbelievable visions that audiences couldn't look away from. Dalí had a good run with the Surrealists, but as another world war threatened Europe, everyone in the group went back to being serious and political again. Breton insisted art be created for revolution, not profit. Dalí wasn't really into all that. After just 10 years with the group, he moved on. America offered Dalí an escape from war, plus endless opportunities for his talents. So that became his next big thing. Dalí introduced Surrealism to the general public and made it fun. His work was everywhere, in fashion, magazines, film. America loved it, and him. They made Dalí a celebrity, embracing his personality, humor, and paintings, and accepting surrealist imagery as a lasting part of everyday culture. As the Second World War became a reality, Breton and the remaining surrealists fled Europe, and the group pretty much fell apart. They couldn't stop the war, but the surrealists forever changed the way we see the world. They used art and philosophy to overthrow an established way of thinking and revolutionize how we express ourselves. And that's pretty impressive. Surrealism encouraged us to take our dreams seriously, made being strange okay, and showed us how art and thinking differently can be a powerful force for social and political change. Surrealism gave us the Salvador Dalí we know and love by providing a group in which he could be his true self and realize his full potential as an artist. In turn, Dalí made Surrealism accessible to all, and because of that, its effects are still felt today. We are left with a legacy of surrealist techniques, terms, and images that inspire us to find our hidden thoughts and embrace our inner weirdness. So do that. Trust in the uncertainty of life. Capture your unconscious. And go make art with purpose. Revolutionary art that changes the way people view the world. Surrealist art begins with your big idea.
So I don't know, what do you think? Did we more or less capture the flavor? Yeah. Was that a little bit easier than listening to my hour lecture? Well, are there any questions? If you're interested, we do have that on our website. You can just go in and type in big ideas in our search and it'll take you right to the right page. Yes? Yes, this is now available. If, direct anybody that you know that might be interested. We're very, very proud of that. I think it's a lot of fun to watch, and definitely we want as many people to know about it as we can. We're going to be showing it with our regular introduction video through the course of the Magritte show, so it's going to be in the theater every day for the entire time. Janet?
I wish I'd seen that when I was a teenager.
It's true. Well, hopefully they'll feel the same way. Thank you all for coming out today. Have a great day.